On March 14th, 2025, Netflix released a movie based on the book from Stalenhag called The Electric State. This was a $350 million movie starring Chris Pratt and Millie Bobby Brown, and had some amazing visuals and special effects. I had previously created a diorama with the catbot that was very close to what appeared in the movie. I enjoyed this fun movie, but Hollywood is gonna Hollywood, and they changed the whole tone of the 2017 book by Simon. In reality, The Electric State is a dark and haunting atmospheric narrative set in an alternate 1990s America, where society is collapsing under the weight of mysterious drone technology and virtual reality. The addiction of these neurocasters creates a devastating effect on the population, and it's these headsets that I wish to portray in my next build. This was a build that really pushed my talents and all the techniques I'd learned over the last few years. I couldn't find any files online, so everything you see bar the wire fence I had to create from scratch. I used a piece of free software called Blender to create these 3D models, and if you head to the description section, you'll find a link to these 3D files. Before you can print the files, you need to slice them. In this case, I'm using Chitterbox. Then I transferred those files on a USB stick, and I'm using this SUNLU 14K standard resin. This stuff's fantastic. It's water-based, and the quality I get out of it is fantastic. I'm using an Elegoo printer, and for dummies like me, they've got a really simple interface. Now the figure's roughly about 1/14 scale, so it's going to take about 24 hours to print. I usually set up to print overnight so it doesn't interfere with my day. With the SUNLU 14K resin that I use, as well as my printer settings, I get virtually no printer lines. In fact, the only printer lines I had on this particular figure was on his left shoulder, right at the top there. It's just because of the way I had it angled. I did print these figures in 2 different sizes just to give me an idea, a comparison as well as a choice. The prints are hollow, so I do have a couple of holes in there that I need to fill. I'm using some of this UV resin from Let's Resin. It's very quick to use. Put a little bubble on there of resin and just hit it with a UV torch. That takes about 5 to 10 seconds to harden. Like I mentioned, I did have some printer lines on there, so using a file and some sanding paper, I just cleaned it all up, and I had some divots there left over from when I pulled the supports off. This was only about 10 to 15 minutes of work. There wasn't much to clean up, and because that resin, that UV resin, dries so quickly, I didn't have to wait around for some putty to dry. That figure's come up really nice after the sanding, and so it should. This is some 6.4mm rod, which I'll be using as a lamppost, and I'll get into that one a little bit later. As usual with my figures, I'll be using Zenithal lighting techniques, so I'll start off with the base of black, then using some of this titanium white. I spray the figure from one direction to give it its highlights and its shadows. And you can use this technique on all sorts of scales, so it doesn't matter if they're 28mm figures or these larger scale ones. For this dude's pants, I'm using some of this medium olive from Vallejo, and I'm giving a really thin coat of this colour. My usual technique for painting figures is I block out the colours first, and this particular colour I'm using for his belt, and then I go in and then add all the highlights to those block colours. The images by Simon Stålenhag, and specifically the Neurocast images, I'm using them more of an inspiration rather than trying to copy one particular image. Now I went with this particular scale for the diorama simply because I want to use some LED lighting in it. This green fluorescent paint from Vallejo, I'll be using that for the green ring. That's a glowing ring on these headsets. The great thing about this particular paint, it glows under UV light. So later on in the hero images, you'll see that whole headset start glowing. Personally, I find painting these larger scale figures far easier than the little ones. I really envy the quality of the figure painters that do them in 1/48 and 1/72. In a few minutes, I'll show you how I did those decals on his shirt. That's coming up. Now it's time to work on this terminal. Off camera, I painted it with some black primer, and here I'm just using some thin masking tape from Tamiya. I'm just creating some lines, in fact 2 lines, just to add a bit of visual interest rather than having it just the plain one color. I'm using some of this dark sea grey to add a bit of weathering to it, and I'm just going to add it in a mottling type technique. I don't want an even coat, just a bit of sort of like a very subtle camouflage. Then to cover all that with a thin coat of some of this steel, also from Vallejo, and this is also going on in a mottled technique. To speed up drying times, I usually use a hairdryer. Once it's all dry, I rip off the 2 GT stripes and make this terminal go faster. And like I mentioned earlier, the t-shirt decals, this is it. Now I was thinking at one stage of using that Star Trek logo, but I ended up going against it because I found this really cool looking still smoking sign. And the reason it's cool, because I found another decal that had this cartoon character having a bit of a smoke. I also used a whole bunch of other decals. Now these are some military ones that I found, and I'm just again adding some visual interest to it. Here I'm just finalizing some of the paintwork on the flashy lights and panel. Now take a note of that decal in the bottom right hand side. This piece was an absolute lifesaver, this wire fence. I was originally going to model it myself in Blender, and then I jumped onto Thingiverse out of curiosity, and lo and behold I came across this thing. It looks fantastic and it's free. Now check out the supports. I've never had a model with so many supports. But geez, look how well that came out. It looks so good, that fence. This terminal needs a logo at the top there. I created these in Photoshop, and they're the manufacturers of those terminals called Center. Then printed on some decal paper, and these are water slides, so you need some water. I also used some decal softener just to make the placement a lot easier, and it came up really well. Very happy with that little logo. I need a lamppost like I mentioned earlier, so I jumped into Blender once again. I'll be using a 40mm LED filament for this. They're only 3 volt, available from my shop, so go check out scalemodelgeek.com.au. Every time I tried to print some rods, some hollow rods, they've always had a warp in them, so hence why I'm going for these styrene rods. Again, 6.4mm they are, and slide straight into these elbow joint and the lamp head. They assemble, they just pop into place, really simple to do. Before I glue everything into place, I make sure everything's squared off. If it's slightly out, it looks a bit bonkers. This is the 40mm LED filament that I'm using. The side that has the little hole in it is the positive side. As you can see, I've masked off the LED and given everything a base coat of some of that sea grey. And I've also done the fence with the same colour. And I made sure I got a nice even coat of that. I then went in with a heavy dry brush of some light metal from Ammo, which is a really thick paint from that company. I then gave the whole thing a wash of some dark brown paint. This is a piece of XPS foam that I cut to 150mm square or 6 inches. And I also scribed some lines in there with a pencil. The base colour is sea grey from Vallejo. This will give me that concrete look. The terminal gets a wash of some light grey, diluted very thinly. So again, that gets into all the nooks and crannies, and then some of that dark brown wash. Time to weather up the base. You can see I've already dry brushed it. Now for this I'm using a bit of brown and also some black wash. At the moment the wash looks really heavy, but what happens is when it dries it comes out a lot lighter, as you can see there. Off camera I stuck a little hole in the middle there. That's where my terminal will be, plus the wiring for that lamppost. At the back I carved out a hole with a hot tool to fit the battery. To get a bit more reflection from that LED filament, I'm using some tin foil cut to size, and then I just super glued that into place. And it works really well. Look at that, first go. I mean, it's only one filament, how can it go wrong? Some of this clear styrene for the cover, and a bit of white glue to glue it into place. And on one side of that clear, I scuffed it up with some 800 grit sandpaper to give me that opaque look. Here I'm just threading through the wirings from the terminal so I can glue the terminal into place. For that I just used some of the 5-minute 2-part araldite. Now the assembly is started, it's starting to look like something. For that wire fence, all I do is use some super glue. Couple spots here and there holds it into place nicely. This is the 3-volt battery holder, just a couple double A's in there, bit of gaffer to hold it into place. Figure gets super glued as well. That's not complicated, that's easy to do. To connect the headset to the terminal, I'm using some of this 1.2mm wire and some of this UV resin, and that'll be my bonding agent because it's so easy to use. One small drop of UV resin on the wire and then hit it with a UV torch for about 5 to 10 seconds and voila, it's there. It's not going anywhere. That fence needs some signage, so I downloaded a whole bunch of images from the internet and I created my own custom one with that little robot as well. That's PVA glue, so I can stick it onto some thicker cardboard to give it a bit of rigidity. Off camera I sealed the images with some clear, then gave them a brown wash. The movie Demolition Man was made in 1993, which suits the time period that Simon's work is based in. It's right here that I started thinking about some more detail. Originally I was going to add some dead vegetation around the fence and in the cracks of that pavement. But when I got to this point, I looked at the whole diorama and I liked the feel of how desolate and sterile the diorama looked. It felt bleak and I liked it. So thanks for sticking around to the end. It's time for you guys to go and check out the hero images. I hope you enjoy them. I really enjoyed doing this build. In fact, it's one of my favorites. I had so much fun creating everything in Blender and then printing it and assembling it all together. Check out some of my previous work. I'd love to know what your thoughts are, and I'll see you in the next video.